knowing that you are adequate after narcissistic abuse. Do you notice that you find yourself to be inadequate almost without cause? Almost like the feeling of inadequacy is there and the specific reason for it shows up maybe later? Or do you perceive yourself to be inadequate in comparison to others? And are you surprised or in disbelief when someone praises you for your adequacy in one way or another? Well, if you answered yes to any of these questions, then you may have had your sense of basic adequacy attacked in relationship to a narcissistic abuser. A narcissistic abuser's efforts to relocate his or her own sense of worthlessness into the scapegoated child or partner can create a very confusing and hurtful self-concept for that scapegoated survivor. And in today's video, I want to explain why it can be forbidden to know your adequacy while in relationship to the narcissistic abuser. And I think that there are basically two reasons. One from the demands of the narcissistic abuser, and the other from the need for attachment security by the scapegoat survivor. And then next, I'll show how this ruse that you are as inadequate as you may feel can be noticed and challenged. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I specialize in helping individuals recover from narcissistic abuse, both in individual therapy and through my online course and accompanying private Facebook community. And to do this, we take a three-pronged approach to recovery that involves making sense of what happened, gaining distance from the narcissistic abuser, and living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And today's video falls under the category of living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And if you survive narcissistic abuse from a parent or a partner, you might check out my free ebook on the topic. The ebook explains why someone is selected to be the scapegoat. And it's not because they're so bad, but actually because they're often so good. And most importantly, why none of this sort of treatment was deserved by the scapegoat survivor. And the ebook makes clear how the process of narcissistic abuse and the role of the scapegoat is all just a product of the narcissistic person's psychopathology and really nothing else. You can find the link to the ebook in the description below or by clicking here. Well, here's an example of the kinds of experience with a narcissistic abuser that can lead to feeling inadequate as a sort of baseline feeling about oneself. Again, these examples are completely anonymous, and they're picked from clinical work, personal experience, and reading about theory and research on the topic of narcissistic abuse. Well, with all that being said, we'll call this fictional client Greg, who came to therapy in his early 30s, complaining of sabotaging himself when he seemed to be on the brink of successes at his job. And as we talked more, it became clear that Greg didn't really suffer from any sort of lack of work ethic or not committing himself to his goals at work, but rather he'd always seemed to be structuring his time so that he was working towards one goal or another. And he remarked how the idea of not working towards something filled him with feelings of disgust about himself. Well, as we continued to work in the therapy, Greg described how he was frequently attacked by his narcissistic father, and the one sure way he knew it would happen was if he was in a state of rest. And he recalled one time where he had gotten a root canal on several of his teeth, and per the dentist orders, he was taking the afternoon off from his summer job as a furniture mover, of all things. And in the therapy, Greg recalled how intense the work was as a furniture mover, particularly in the hot summer, and he was very relieved to have had the day off. Well, his narcissistically abusive father walked into the room where Greg was laying down and asked him what he was doing. And then when Greg explained that he was resting from the root canal, his father went ballistic and told him to get his work clothes on immediately and go back to work, and that he was being self-indulgent and lazy by trying to skip work for this BS reason. And so, of course, Greg had no choice but to go back to work with his head throbbing as the pain medication wore off and move the heavy furniture for the rest of the day. In the therapy, Greg said that going to work was still better than accepting his father's accusations of how inadequate he was for resting. And although this was one egregious example of how Greg's father would refuse to let him be at peace when he was trying to rest, he would also incessantly harass Greg in a lot of different ways that sent the message to Greg that he was inadequate and needed to always prove otherwise. Well, this is one pretty awful example of how Greg's father refused to let him experience himself as adequate if he was resting or in seeming peace. But there was lots of other ways that Greg's father would work to send Greg the message that his baseline was of being an inadequate person, and that he had to work really hard, Greg had to work really hard to prove to his father otherwise. Whether it was putting silverware in the dishwasher the wrong way, or failing to bring home a permission slip for a field trip to get signed when Greg was a young boy, or not knowing how to do a task that he'd never done before, but his father had told him to do, like say sand and water the deck that was in their backyard, which he had no experience doing. Whenever these sort of setups would happen, Greg's father would yell at and attack Greg's character for not doing these things adequately. But the core attitude of his father was that Greg as a person was inadequate. And this was evident in how his father curiously omitted to credit Greg for any of Greg's obvious adequacies. I mean, he was a really good student, but his father would accuse him of not doing his homework or having to keep a watchful eye over Greg to make sure he was doing what he was supposed to as a student. Greg was also a very empathic person and his father that never seemed to even occur to notice about Greg. Well, the pattern Greg ended up wanting to work on in his therapy was how he could defy his narcissistic father's rule that he live his life from the assumption that he's inadequate as a person. Well, it was very clear that one of the triggers for Greg to feel particularly inadequate was being at a state of rest. And he came by those feelings pretty honestly, as evidenced by how his father would make him feel even more inadequate for such very necessary moments of rest, just like in the root canal example. So later in life, if Greg was at work or engaged in an activity after work or on the weekends, he could feel reasonably okay about himself. But as soon as he had free time, then he would feel like he was sinking into an abyss internally. And it was an abyss marred by a feeling of inadequacy. And Greg realized that he'd never experienced the feeling of a job well done, despite having done many jobs quite well in his life. And this is where therapy worked to help Greg gain the insight into the origins of this feeling of inadequacy and help him change his definition of his problem. That his problem wasn't that he hadn't done enough yet to prove his adequacy as a person, but that he held the faulty assumption that he was inadequate to begin with. And the therapist was helpful in this regard by expressing how differently he saw and experienced Greg to be than how his father treated him. And that is, his therapist saw and treated Greg as someone who deserved respect, was worthy of admiration for his actual traits as a person, and that Greg was fundamentally a good and adequate person. So as Greg got more accustomed to being treated the way he really deserved to be, in the therapy, he was able to see more clearly how his father managed his own deep sense of shame by finding Greg to be the inadequate one in all the ways I've described. Well, eventually Greg grew able to offer compassion towards himself for having to believe in his inadequacy as the only way to stay attached to his narcissistically abusive father, and that it was necessary for him to have someone, even if that someone treated him horribly, than to have no one at all. And by the end of therapy, Greg could afford himself many more times in his life of doing a whole lot of nothing, as it was put, without feeling that sense of inadequacy. He carried around a sense of himself that felt a lot more true to him, that he was a capable man who expected to be treated as such by the people in his life. And this new expectation helped him select and cultivate relationships with people who treated him as such too. Well, I wanted to go into depth on the example of Greg because it highlights how a narcissistically abusive parent can work to find the scapegoat survivor inadequate, why the scapegoat often has to buy into that message of his own inadequacy, and finally it touches on the elements needed to disconfirm this legacy of inadequacy. Greg's father had to find Greg as inadequate because he couldn't tolerate his own deeply felt sense of inadequacy. His father found it helpful to see his own inadequacy in Greg, then act in ways that influenced Greg to identify with that feeling. So, his father's incessant attacks on Greg's choices was often how he worked to influence Greg to identify with these feelings of inadequacy that his father couldn't stand in himself. And on Greg's side was his own need to have a shared reality with his father so that he had a parent whom he could believe was willing to care for him. And the only reality Greg's father could tolerate was one where Greg was the problem because Greg was fundamentally inadequate in the face of life's demands. Or so Greg's father claimed. So Greg really had to assume this about himself because it afforded him a way to have someone to attach to. I think it's a fundamental truth for humans that our first priority, particularly as kids, is having someone there. And next is feeling good about who we are. So if we can't secure a bond with a caregiver, then our feelings about ourselves will get used in the effort to create some sort of bond. And this was so clear in the case of Greg's experience with his father. But it also points to how this experience can be recovered from. Because in therapy, it was obvious that Greg was not the way his father had treated him, and he got to learn that the security of his relationship to the therapist didn't depend on him finding himself to be inadequate as his father had needed him to find himself to be. That is, the therapist accepted him unconditionally. So if Greg were to feel good about himself and see himself as adequate, it wouldn't threaten the bond with the therapist. Well, this of course was a process and took some time, but Greg was able to eventually live in a way where he could feel attached to and good about himself in the same relationship. And that was something he certainly yearned for in his childhood, but was pretty much entirely unavailable to him. Well, what can you do to combat the legacy of felt inadequacy as a consequence of narcissistic abuse? I think the importance of safe relationships can't be overstated here. Therapy is one way to do this, especially because it allows you to gain insight into all of the ways this required assumption of your inadequacy might be operating in your life. And whether it's with a therapist or elsewhere in your life, finding good, safe people is a way to get to know that you can now feel good about who you are and expect continued connection to and from others. That it doesn't have to be one or the other anymore. And towards that end, you might find Module 4 in my online course on recovery from narcissistic abuse particularly helpful, because it goes into depth about how to find safe people who can afford the kind of interaction needed to disconfirm this belief in your own inadequacy. And I think it can help you make sure you're not surrounding yourself with people who might be similar to Greg's father and need to find you as the inadequate one in order to manage their own emotional problems. Well, I hope you found today's video useful and why, chronic sort of feelings of being inadequate are often not your own feelings or even perceptions about yourself, but ways you may have had to cope to kind of get along with a narcissistically abusive parent or partner, and hopefully how that can be noticed and really challenged so that you get to kind of recover an authentic sense of your own adequacy as a person. Well, thanks for watching today, and again for your continued support of the channel. I look forward to posting again next Sunday. Take care.